Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to spend with us. So this webinar is Finance Spotlight, How to Master Compliance with Next Gen Technology. My name is Tony Higgins. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Blueprint Software Systems. We're a company that focuses on aligning business and IT and also compliance organizations through technology platforms. And with me here today is David Paris. David's AVP Banking and Financial Services Consulting and Governance, Risk, and Compliance Lead at Cognizant Worldwide. And David, I'll just let you introduce yourself a little further.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to speak with you all, and a pleasure to be asked by our good software partner, Blueprint Systems, with who we work closely. We've collaborated together on a number of different implementations in the financial services and insurance industries in both North America as well as in Europe.
Great, thanks very much. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to talk just briefly about enterprise pressures in this space. And the bulk of today is actually going to be a conversation just between David and myself on compliance in finance. And then again, very briefly, just on Scaled Agile for regulated industries, a focus topic before we enter into a Q&A session. Just a few quick ground rules for today. We'll present for about 30 minutes. If you do have questions throughout the conversation today, just send them to us through the questions panel or section, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. But when they do spring to mind, just type them in and we'll queue them up at this end. Also, webinar attendees will receive a complimentary copy of our latest ebook called Financial Services Spotlight, Accelerating Innovation in the Midst of Regulatory Change. So without further ado, let me enter into the first topic, which is just enterprise pressures. Excuse me. So of course, global enterprises today are under immense pressure, and countless of them, but there are three key that we want to spotlight, at least in this session today. One is the delivery of customer value. So these large organizations, of course, going through digital disruption in a big way and increasing, being driven to innovate, and also most of the companies that we work with, at least, have been in business for quite some time and have degrees of legacy in their portfolios and have modernization as one aspect of this as well. And so delivering customer value is just a relentless pressure to do so, and especially in a marketplace with lots of new entrants into the space, not being bound by those legacy pressures, holding them back, and being able to do end runs in certain points of the business. So that's one huge pressure organizations have to contend with. Another is speed and agility. So having to move faster and having the ability to pivot when needed as markets and demands change. Of course, translating into faster delivery, we need to do this not in the miniature, but of course at scale. And a big part of this is transitioning portfolios to cloud technology, which is one aspect of enabling us to be more agile and not weighed down by, the burden of on-premise infrastructure. So all of these are coming to bear. Now, the areas in the organization that bear the brunt of this, of course, are the lines of business in delivering value to customers and markets, and IT. Those who provide the technology infrastructure on which that business runs, in many respects, is bearing the brunt of the speed and agility pressures. And then, of course, there's a third constituent in the conversation, and that's all of those involved in compliance with the ever-increasing weight of regulation and volume and frequency of regulatory change, and having to contend with that while trying to do the two things I just spoke of in terms of value delivery and agility. So if I double click on those just for a moment, within an organization, what we have seen is why many are challenged in their ability to respond to these pressures. again, there's several things, but a few key ones tend to bubble to the top. One is a lack of alignment across the groups. And I'd say particularly for IT to deliver business value or value to the business so they can in turn execute on their value stream or value chain to deliver to the market. And that these solutions IT delivers need to be compliant. And of course, that the business and its other operations and business processes being compliant as well. So alignment across these three groups is absolutely key. Without it, it does tend to hold organizations back. And as I said before, our target customers it's not about doing things in a small way. It's all about scaling. So being able to do this at the scale the business demands and the business needs, scaling is just hard in principle. And having technology be able to support large groups of people in just about every case distributed, oftentimes across contractual boundaries and outsourcing arrangements, et cetera, being able to do these three things at scale is just very, very difficult. And finally, being data driven. Of course, enterprises produce volumes and volumes of data, but step one is to be able to persist that data, which is key and important. Not all data is persisted, first of all. Some very valuable intellectual property is literally being left on the floor. So being able to persist, especially the data we need to be able to leverage later through modern technologies such as AI, machine learning, et cetera, for purposes of reuse and decision augmentation or decision making. And the interesting thing is that data needs to be collected now, even if you intend to leverage 2, 3, 4 years down the road. If you start collecting it then, it is, of course, too late. So those are just some of the focus points I wanted to kind of provide as a bit of a backdrop. And then at this point, would just like to get into a conversation with David, and maybe I'll ask a few questions and we can take it from there.
Okay, fine. Yes, Tony, what a thing I'll do first before go into the questions is just a few comments on the last two slides that you've shown. One of the things that certainly we have noticed, and just to clarify who Cognizant is for everybody, we're a Fortune 200 IT services firm, a carve out from Dun & Bradstreet originally. Probably a number of you will know of us. If I'm lucky, all of you will know of us. But we, being a carve out from Dun & Bradstreet, most of the world's larger banks are clients of ours and use us relatively extensively. Just to go back to the slide now, so you're clear about kind of where I'm coming from. One of the things that we've noticed when you talk about the business value, Tony, your slide talked about an increased emphasis on innovation. And one of the things that we're seeing quite a bit of that is a new development pretty much the last 12 months or so is a lot of chief innovation officers being named. Number one, it's a new title. It's a bit like chief data officer, which was a new title as of about 10 years ago. We have a number of clients that I work with, especially in Europe, that have added chief innovation officers at their global line of business level. And we even have one good client that is a GCIFI organization that has a chief innovation officer in their RegTech division. So I think the emphasis on innovation is really very salient to focus upon, and as a result, you have the need to be able to revisit existing IT, applications and the data that supports them on a very regular basis with even more frequency than you did in the past. Just to go then again real briefly onto the second slide where you talked about lack of alignment. One of the things that I suspect most of you will have seen in your own organizations, and certainly I've noticed in the industry generally, is that responses, both in terms of business process, in terms of data gathering or provisioning, as well as in terms of the actual technology to support, quite often is very tactical in nature, in that the response will tend to be a point solution to address a specific compliance problem. And so as a result, you have a large number of Band-Aids, I guess you might say, of a sort that have been put together to deal with the multiplicity and complexity of compliance and risk challenges, as opposed to being able to step back, look at it holistically in a coherent fashion, and come up with something that is enterprise scalable, to your point about scaling, but deals with at least 80%, if not more, of the compliance and risk requirements through a relatively more integrated capability. And the capability probably won't be from one application or one database, but at least it won't be just bits and bobs of things stitched together in a tactical fashion. Let's put it that way.
Right.
So just going on to the questions now, and keep me honest as far as time frames as well, because I'm conscious that we're trying to keep this to 30 minutes. A few of the key questions that we had come up with have to do with some of the modern banking practices, or digital first services that are beginning to transform finance. Certainly we see a lot of reference where I work to the terms open banking, which has to do with, to Tony's point, about new competitors coming into the market or being permitted to come into the market. I work out of our London operation, and so we have the so-called Payment Services Directive that is relevant in the EU and the UK, which has created an entirely new class of what are called payment services providers, that most of which are not banks, never were banks to begin with. They are much more like card operations providers, I guess you might say, in a sense. And as a result, they are not bound by the kind of legacy technology, to Tony's point, that most organizations have to deal with. And they are much more flexible, much more nimble, much lighter in terms of touch and ability to be agile and come up with new responses to client requirements. One of the other key things that we see being one of the biggest challenges is, and this has probably started about 15 to 20 years ago when you began to see decimalization, certainly in the U.S. securities markets, there's a real explosion of data, largely due to much higher granularity, both requirements from a regulatory perspective as well as capture and execution from the principal financial organization's perspective. And that just puts a really big burden on databases, on data lakes, in terms of the volumes they were dealing with, and actually makes and doing analytics well. I think it makes it harder than it used to be, because there's so much data with so many different dimensions and such a wide range of parameters that you really need to look at your demand side of what is the question that you're trying to resolve, and work back from that on a demand basis to determine, to Tony's point, what data is it that you want to complete a specific piece of analytics. If you start conversely from the supply side and just take all the data that might be available, you'll really be overwhelmed, number one. You'll get into have difficulty seeing the forest for the trees, number two. And so when I work with clients, one of the key things that I focus on is really try to answer that exam demand side, put demand pull question first in your mind clearly, to then plan, then what types of data do you need, to what level of granularity, rather than boiling the ocean, and then be very clear about what kind of changes, enrichments, enhancements to that data you need to do the other calculations or do the presentation to solve the exam question and make the regulator and your compliance and audit people happy internally.
All right. I guess part of the problem in that, or a bit of a balancing act, I guess, is trying to anticipate what future questions will be. As I say, 3 years down the road, I may have some question I'm not even aware of, And if I hadn't collected the data for the last 3 years, then I'm stuck.
Yeah. I mean, you especially see that. I'm sure a lot of you, depending on what part of your organizations you work with, will be familiar with the comprehensive capital adequacy and DoddFrank stress testing regulations that come into play in North America and the United States predominantly the last several years. And the biggest challenge that we found with organizations dealing with those and the comparable ones for Basel III in the EU is that you need to have a certain amount of kind of backtest data from prior years versus to compare your outcomes. So Tony, to the point that you made, one of the biggest challenges is exactly having data from prior years that you didn't know that you needed to collect. It's almost like a regression testing challenge. Similarly, certainly in the EU, again, with the MiFID II regulations that are relatively newish, that had a similar impact where you were asked to compare some of your actual trading volumes versus prior year volumes. And in most cases, the organizations that had to do the reporting hadn't kept records of what their trading volumes were in the types of securities that they were being asked to report on. So they had to go back and do quite a bit of, hamster chasing to get that earlier data to then be able to do the comparison that the European regulators require.
Yeah, turns into an expensive forensic science exercise, I guess.
Exactly.
There's another question we had, like, what are the most, with all the change that organizations are undergoing now, of course, what are some of the most common risks or maybe the highest priority risks on a broad sense that financial institutions need to care about, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that some of the biggest risks that they're dealing with, one of them is that, getting the trees out of the forest, so to speak, being able to parse and say, what is most critical to my operations? And so I would say the biggest risk is identifying your dependencies effectively. Root cause analysis is really the key thing. And if you do that well, it doesn't mean you have to do it to the nth degree, but if you use kind of the 80-20 rule, at least to start, I say these are the key 2 to 3 drivers of a specific outcome, whether it is an outcome related to financial crime management, for example, or whether it's an outcome related to credit risk exposure volatility. Identifying those is probably the most difficult thing for organizations to do. And I think that when organizations end up having large losses that they weren't anticipating, quite often that is more than likely due to not having done an adequately effective job at identifying what the key drivers of risk or compliance exposure is, and trying to play almost whack-a-mole by gathering data and keeping up to speed on everything equally, rather than saying, right, if one thing goes wrong, what will cause me the biggest pain, so to speak, as opposed to trying to eliminate absolutely all pain in every single area. So I think that whole prioritization is one of the biggest challenges, and then putting in the kind of control mechanisms that once you've identified the drivers, that actually can manage those driver factors earlier in the process rather than waiting for them to occur and actually cause the exposure and cause the pain themselves. In terms of types of risk, real briefly, I think that most organizations are much better at measuring and managing credit risk exposure than they used to be, largely due to capital adequacy regulations being much more robust. What I'm seeing a lot more of now is something that I started working on first probably 18, 19 years ago in a prior life when I worked for Deutsche Bank, which is financial crime and cyber-related risks are probably the 2 biggest things that you hear a lot of people focusing on in terms of either a remediation
Right.
or in terms of trying to get their arms around predicting cyber-related types of exposures that might occur in organizations. So I would say in terms of traditional risk classes, probably those. And then the third one that is a bit more of a focus the last couple of years is third-party vendor risk concentration management as well, which goes to your kind of focus on the so-called integrated risk management types of platforms that a lot of organizations have begun to use more fully and effectively.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. I'm going to question kind of around how banks are managing current regulations. As stated earlier, both local and international regulatory landscapes for banks and institutions, I mean, it's so dynamic that catching up with these, of course, and maintaining compliance, of course, is hugely challenging. I mean, we have GDPR, SFTR, for instance, that have such an impact that failing to comply can result in, obviously, heavy fines and so on. How are banks currently managing this whiplash from all these regulatory updates and obligations?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases, perhaps not as well as they could do in an ideal world. I mean, you tend to see, and you talked about this to a certain extent in some of the earlier slides, most of the approaches tend to be rather fragmented and tactical, kind of playing that so-called whack-a-mole game I was describing, where new regulation comes up and the reaction will tend to be less on what is that similar to that we may already be dealing with in some other guise or where it's using the same data. And the approach to resolving it is a bit of a standalone, one-off tactical thing that you then band-aid in. But you tend to be hitting maybe the same databases again to deal with that, where in reality, if you had a proper data lake or warehouse or database, you would have pulled that data once and use it for many different, compliance or risk purposes. The other thing that you tend to see is that the approaches are quite line of business or product specific, and so they're not really adequately coherent. Or account for, where they take account of dependencies that, for example, if you did it across multiple products or multiple lines of business, and you did this kind of root cause analysis that I was describing earlier, you might find that there were multiple product areas or multiple lines of business that ended up having a key dependency on the same factor, so to speak. Whereas if you do that with separate solutions, that concentration risk, because of concentration on a single factor or a very small number of factors, doesn't jump out nearly as completely as it could. You are beginning to see increasingly greater use of agile methodology rather than just conventional legacy waterfall methodology in dealing with some of these challenges. Having said that, compliance types of challenges do not always directly lend themselves easily to the short, sharp kind of sprint approach that agile development uses. And as a result, you really need to be very good in terms of understanding your business requirements up front and comprehensively and coherently identifying the controls you need before you start launching yourself down a set of development cycles or sprints, because otherwise you risk missing possibly some quite critical factors by not coherently doing that the wrecking on that up front.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point, especially, I mean, in this context, as you say, I mean, we have the regulation or the mandate, right? And sometimes quite large. So we have that information up front versus many places where Agile is being applied, which is really a process of discovery because we don't know what we need. And it's a means to discover what we need incrementally, which is kind of interesting. And this is not that necessarily.
No. Without question.
Yeah. What about reinventing compliance, if I were to think of it that way, and largely the introduction of technology? I mean, largest organizations in the world, they've acknowledged the need to digitize not just their banking solutions, if we're talking about banks, but also their internal processes. and work they do along compliance. So they're moving away from legacy manual processes in this regard to technology-enabled solutions. So what's the impact of innovation on regulation and compliance, and I guess specifically the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, I think that there are probably three key trends that I would cite in that regard. I think that people are increasingly beginning to realize that compliance and risk management is an integral part of the business as usual process. And it's not just a set of reactions or remediations that are one-offs, but you have to almost dynamically, consistently be looking out for changes, as well as reassessing how your current processes and data enable you or not to deal with new regulatory challenges. So I think that BAU kind of DNA, as opposed to it being largely a change type process that happens every so often, is a really key cultural thing that is getting more bedded down than it was, probably a decade ago, at least. I think secondly, firms are beginning to realize something that I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that looking across multiple different regulations to identify what types of common questions are different regulations asking, and especially where they are asking questions where the answers to those questions depend on the same data elements, even though the regulations themselves might have come up from different regulators or from different starting points. The raw material you require to respond to them is actually the same kind of raw material across the multiple different regulations. That is a key change that I'm beginning to see increasingly compared with the past, and that helps you resolve a little bit this fragmented tactical way of doing things. But that is still more of I think, an art as opposed to a science. And then the third thing that I think probably both the capital adequacy three things: capital adequacy reporting regulations, transaction reporting regulations, and then financial crime related focus as well, have forced firms to have much better comprehension of data lineage and preserving the integrity of that, and ensuring that there is adequate transparency to know that when you report, for example, a specific capital adequacy figure to a regulator, you have to be able to deconstruct to them and show exactly what the components of that outcome calculation or how you got to that figure. I mean, the first time that I saw that really deconstructed or remediated in anger was a number of years ago when I worked for IBM, and we had to help one of our GSIFI clients, and is headquartered in Europe, deal with a problem where their regulator had said, right, you've given me this capital adequacy figure, tell me how you got to it, and they couldn't deconstruct it, and we had to assist them with quite an extensive information integrity and information discovery, and then finally robust data model and data hierarchy approach to improving their ability to do that going forward. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I've heard stories like that before. They can be massive, and expensive and risky and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it was all of those in this instance.
Yeah. When I talk about reg tech just for a minute, or technology, and maybe just specific technologies. So, I mean, the banking industry, obviously, there's almost no choice. We have to digitize. All our competitors are, and that's not just supporting faster and better digital development of our business applications, but also at the same time, of course, we need to stay compliant, and we're applying technology toward that problem, coining the term reg tech. So what are some of the emerging technologies that help overcome compliance challenges specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the first and foremost, the one that most people will go to, is certainly blockchain. is beginning to have a much greater impact and influence in, aspects where you have to be able to consistently validate and attest about the identity or source of certain information. We are involved in helping a consortium of banks that have developed blockchain initially to focus on being used for trade finance, transaction purposes, execution, as well as identification of, beneficiaries, openers, people that are submitting documents to get paid, those types of things.
Right.
A second area of emerging technology that we're seeing be used, less for just compliance purposes, but more for overall development, is use of container-based development, which is really, rather than getting a very large estate of infrastructure, basically just pulling down sub-portions of infrastructure to perform application development activities, kind of almost a, pay for what you eat, as opposed to you show up at a buffet and you pay a fixed price, and it doesn't matter whether you just have one plate or five, you're paying a fixed price. Container-based approaches might make those kind of compliance-related build costs a little bit more rational rather than paying for things that you don't necessarily need to use. And then the third key area are what I would call kind of microservices, focused applications, and those are used not merely for compliance purposes, but obviously for an awful lot of consumer retail client interaction in terms of transaction execution and fulfillment processes. But we are beginning to see microservices used increasingly in some of the financial crime, identity validation areas to which I was alluding earlier.
Okay. I got one more for you. How about how can banks future-proof compliance? I mean, compliance is not a one-off activity, of course. I mean, we have Brexit happening, and of course, we just came through specific regulations. We just came through GDPR, et cetera. Actually, many are not through it yet. And all of these things, of course, pose new challenges. And financial institutions need to be and shift their posture to be more proactive than reactive. So specifically, how can banks take advantage of the current compliance solutions, to hopefully gain compliance, maintain compliance, and guarantee that as best they can?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give an example. First of all, give an example of a client that we work with quite extensively, as does one of our other vendor partners, and then I'll go through, I think, some of the key principles that might be best to keep in mind overall. So this client bank is a GSIFI. It is headquartered in Europe nominally, but it has very extensive operations throughout the globe without question.
Right.
So even though it's headquartered in Europe, it has extremely big franchises in the United States and North America, as well as in Asia Pacific. And to a certain extent, it probably has, I suspect, both retail and wholesale, more clients outside of Europe than it does within Europe, actually.
Okay.
So that client about 8 or 9 years ago purchased one of what were the so-called GRC platforms, and now IRM is integrated risk management is a term that tends to be used more than the older GRC platform adage. That platform was purchased by them initially by their group audit function to essentially centralize policies relating to certain areas that the internal audit function would work upon, and then begin to become a centralized repository for audit attest results, which would be similar to the risk control self-assessment type of results that would be performed by other areas.
Right.
And they've been quite successful with it and really liked it. And so they've taken that from group audit, and they are now comprehensively reusing that same IRM platform in the IT and process risk assessment and risk control self-assessment areas throughout the entire organization. So the same platform is getting much broader use than it used to do. And I think you're going to begin to see that trend more and more, as opposed to multiplicities of platforms across areas like compliance, risk, and audit. Those functions are increasingly beginning to look at using, if not the same platform, then certainly the same data. So there's much less problem with reconciliation or saying, right, one party has one version of the truth and the other party's versions of the truth is not the same. They're at least using the same starting points or the same filtering mechanisms by using the same platforms of sorts.
Right.
So just three key principles about how you best use those solutions. And again, the platforms themselves do not guarantee compliance standalone. You have to think about it very much in the sense of working with the data that already exists in the estate overall, because usually these IRM platforms do not take in all of the transactional data or legacy data. They start as policy and standard bearers. So what we tend to do is say, focus on coming up as early as possible with a fairly standardized, centralized policy directory. And again, that is not saying that the content has to be centralized, but you certainly have a centralized directory or index of how you bring the policies together and can view them in a comparative centralized fashion, and that those are updated on a BAU basis continually through different kind of data feed mechanisms that are more push than pull. A second key area that relates to using that platform most effectively is establishing what I will call, older term, enterprise search capability linkage, that we use things like artificial intelligence, that we use machine learning, it may be neural network types of approaches that then go through the existing legacy data in the organization, standard operating procedures, that type of thing, and look for clauses or keywords that relate to the policies, that themselves the policies exist in that central directory or available through that centralized directory or central index system. So you're then tying the actual operating standards and the operational transaction data and controls to what the policy static data profiles are that are in that IRM platform. And that it's really key to think about those as two key functionality capabilities. And then I think the third thing we're beginning to see more frequently is a long time ago when I first started out kind of in banking, financial services, people would tend to do risk control self-assessment, revisitation, maybe at most once a year in a lot of cases. They would only be done every other year, almost as kind of a box-ticking exercise. What you're beginning to see more and more of is risk control self-assessment or control self-assessment reviews being done much more frequently, in some cases even quarterly or semi-annually. They are not necessarily as thoroughgoing and invasive in every single way, but the key thing is the latency period is much reduced, and the emphasis is less on documenting everything that's there and much more focusing on what has happened since the last one, what has changed, only what has changed since the last one was done, and are those changes of a type that might lead to additional exposure that require greater focus on just the areas that changed for further drill down.
Wow, excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Just before we get to some Q&A, I just want to wrap up with one statement. It kind of follows on to what you were just saying, David, about essentially alignment and bridging the gap across these groups and connecting the underlying data sets and information. Having the opposite, having disconnects, i.e., causes all sorts of ambiguity, miscommunication, errors, and ends up costing money and time. So new technologies, and that's what we're in the business of doing, obviously, is we provide a platform which essentially does these three things and pulls them together. So on the compliance side, the Blueprint technology is able to source regulatory content on an ongoing basis, provide workflow to interpret, assess impact in the organization, like on those standard operating procedures, as you mentioned, effect and control, remediation and changes to bring ourselves into compliance and to be able to report on that. On the business side, in the same platform repository, we can hold business level objectives, strategy, etc. We can literally visualize it through graphical diagrams and models, the value stream or value chain of the business at the highest level, customer journeys, or the journey we want to take our customer through. Decompose that down into business processes of any number of levels, depending on complexity, and even down further than that. And I'll talk about that in the IT side. And of course, hold policies, controls, and whatever your taxonomy of information happens to be. And on the IT side, it seamlessly evolves from that business information to decompose even further into explicit functional models of what do we want or need our business applications to do functionally, and have the various constraints like our regulatory obligations, but other constraints as security, reliability, availability, they come to bear. We can visualize through UI mockups that behavior, even walk through storyboards to get everybody's thumbs up before we actually do go into our sprints and implement. And we can auto-generate stories and tests, the assets that drive development and validation directly from those models. So it's a pretty unique solution, and be able to track that work until completion. The net result of all this is it's a unified single repository for all the information across business IT compliance, removing those barriers. So we don't need to do data conversion, data uploads and downloads, etc. It's one set in a unified space. We have proven scalability. There's literally thousands and thousands of concurrent users, millions of artifacts that we're talking about. And the net result of all of this is you bring alignment of the information, which helps facilitate alignment of the people and the work that they're doing. So in our view, this is what's needed today. There are technologies out there to do that, and we are certainly one of them. So with that, I think I'll just slide into some Q&A. Once again, if anybody has questions, please just type them into, the lines are muted for obvious reasons. If you do have any questions, just type them in the Q&A panel. And we'll get to a few of them here in the time we have left. So the first one, actually, it's for me. It's about the product. So we would like to have diagrams or models of our business processes and have our controls mapped to them. That's the next stage of our modernization. Is this possible with Blueprint? So I can take that one. Right. Yes.
Yeah. I'll take that. Yeah. I mean, that's you've almost. I don't know whether you've either done some reading in advance on Blueprint or not, but that is almost exactly what is done. In essence, how we tend to use Blueprint is going through the process of, first of all, gathering business requirements from the line of business side. Those business requirements then are, I guess you might say, assessed and or filtered to say what kind of key control types are necessary to control some of the requirements so that you don't have adverse outcomes. You end up getting the outcomes that you want. Those are business controls. Those are supervisory controls. They may be monitoring of volumes, what have you. Those controls and the business requirements then go through maybe a final risk assessment after the operating controls are put in to say, right, is the residual risk after those controls are effective something that the organization is comfortable with? When that then takes place, that is then put into development code, into the IT side of the shop, and then the original requirements and the business controls that were determined in the earlier steps help automatically generate IT test scripts that are used to test the development work that has been done in that, I guess it's probably the third or fourth step that I described. But it does tie together in exactly the fashion that the person who asked the question, suggested that their organization is trying to go.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Next question, squarely in your space, Dave. Do you see the rate or pace of regulatory change increasing dramatically, or leveling off in the next few years? What's your prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair, I think there's an awful lot of regulatory fatigue, whether you are in the States or whether you're in Europe or wherever, maybe a little bit less so in Asia Pacific, but certainly in Europe and the United States. And you also have somewhat different, aside from the fatigue, you have slightly different political regimes that either are more laissez-faire or more interventionist, depending on kind of who's in power at what time. So right. I think that there will be a bit more of a respite than there has been for a while. That's not to say it will go away entirely. I think especially financial crime type things will be the exception to that, so financial crime and cybercrime in particular. But there is still an awful lot of catch-up work to do, because I think it's fair to say in most instances, and I'll use the example of MiFID II in Europe and then CCAR and DFAST in the United States, there are relatively few organizations that are subject to those regulations that have really good institutional strength, BAU processes, outputs that they can just flick a switch and it all works, like the perfect world. Most firms for both MiFID II and CCAR DFAST submissions have adopted tactical, less than perfect solutions just to be able to be de minimis compliant by certain points in time. But there's an awful lot of manual effort. There's an awful lot of rework that ends up happening. And I think those organizations will begin to try to make the solutions for those types of things a little bit more strategic, a little bit more enterprise institutional strength, and more effective as a result, and somewhat less manual and somewhat more fully automated and straight through in terms of processing, rather than slightly different cut-up cottage industry processes that then get stitched together and presented properly, but you can unpick them if you really are focused on trying to do so.
Right. Okay, one more. When looking at the Blueprint platform, to adopt something like that, it sounds like it's more than a tool change. In our organization, at least, it would likely involve process changes, perhaps even culture changes. How would we approach something like this? Sounds like a Cognizant question.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think there's a huge amount of process change required necessarily, because a lot of organizations are using things that do part of what Blueprint does already. I think the difference about Blueprint versus other tools that I've seen is Blueprint in a single platform has end-to-end capabilities that you may have had separately historically in a tool that gathers business requirements and a tool that does process mapping or design, and that type of an IRM platform that you described, and then separate test creation types of tooling. So Blueprint is more stitching those capabilities together in I think a relatively well-conceived and integrated and consistent end-to-end platform. I do think that the biggest change, the biggest impact of bringing Blueprint in and using it, it is a bit of a cultural thing. And it's less that it's cultural in the sense that it's culturally difficult. It's more the awareness in the buyer environment that you want that level of consistency, standardization, end to end, and the output from one predecessor phase directly becoming the input to the next phase, as I talked about business requirements, to control definition, to risk assessment, to into code development, into testing. I think it's that kind of a cultural buy-in that is, I wouldn't say it's difficult. It just requires a certain amount of agreement among probably 2 to 3 different stakeholder groups. But most of the companies that we work with, when you describe it to them, the light goes on and they say, yes, that makes a lot of sense, and they're willing to do it. And I think the Blueprint platform can be used in a lightest touch way, that it's not like putting in an ERP system like a SAP or a PeopleSoft or something like that in older days when those were very, very complex. And I had experience with that about 15 years ago. And if you get one little thing wrong, then everything goes kablooey and you have to start from scratch. Blueprint is much more agile, flexible, and orchestration focused as opposed to heavy-handed. So this may be a long answer to a short question, but I think the questioner raising the aspect of kind of cultural awareness, that is the really key thing to focus upon. And you get everybody aware and focused on that at a consistent and higher level, then I think using Blueprint can result in quite substantial benefits.
Excellent. David, thank you so very much for doing this. This is awesome. Really appreciate it. And everybody on the call, you're going to get an email with a recording of the presentation and a complimentary copy of our latest ebook, like I mentioned before. The ebook highlights tips for financial organizations on effectively managing risk and compliance while transitioning to Agile. So once again, thank you all very, very much, and especially you, David. And
no, pleasure. And I'd like to thank everybody as well for taking the time to listen. And please feel free through Tony to route whatever kind of follow-up questions or requests that you might have to us. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.